Subscribe, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from.
In late 1994, following a routine review of declassified NORARC satellite reels from the previous decade, analysts noticed a discrepancy involving a small structure catalogued on the western ridge of Senja Island, a place nominally used for coastal weather instrumentation and little else. Yet archivists flagged the site years earlier because the building's thermal signature didn't match any registered civilian facility. Older frames from 1983 to 1987 showed a rectangular module with 2 auxiliary sheds and a narrow service path carved through the birch scrub. But by spring 1994 the structure was simply gone, not collapsed or burned out, but erased with such precision that even foundation shadows, normally visible due to soil compaction, were absent, as if the terrain had been digitally replaced, though these were raw film scans, not composites, which made the anomaly harder to explain. According to a retired lighthouse keeper in Grillafjord, a man who kept meticulous handwritten logs of marine traffic, an unmarked naval vessel approached the coast on the exact week the building vanished, shutting down radio chatter for several hours, under the pretext of a frequency test. Yet he swore that around 2 o'clock, he saw container crates, matte black and unnumbered, being ferried across the waves by rigid-hulled boats with their lights killed, the crews moving with a kind of clinical urgency, transferring equipment from a land team, whose silhouettes seemed bulkier than standard winter gear, as if wearing some reinforced environmental suits. The keeper added that the approaching fog looked unnatural, forming a low curtain around the ridge where the building had stood, and he described it not as weather but like steam rolling down from something hot buried just under the rock, a detail dismissed during initial interviews, but later cross-referenced with seismic logs that registered shallow vibrations during those same hours. Too weak for natural tectonics yet too rhythmic to be random. Meanwhile, internal memos from the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment, partially released in 2003, included oblique mentions of an outpost off Senja, status resolved, though no prior reference to such an outpost exists in any public registry. That phrasing triggered speculation among former intelligence contractors who had worked Arctic monitoring during the Cold War, one of whom stated anonymously that Senja had been a sandbox site, a term used for locations where experimental sensing arrays were tested on geomagnetic irregularities, but no one would clarify what kind of arrays required fully classified staffing, night extractions, and soil sterilization protocols, the latter indicated by spectral differences in the satellite images showing the land had been treated chemically to eliminate trace residues before dawn. By early 1995, a joint academic survey from Troms intended to map subarctic flora noticed that vegetation on the ridge grew in a perfect rectangular void, a shape too geometrically clean to occur naturally, and matching almost exactly the footprint of the erased facility. Yet the soil within the outline was unusually fine, sifted to a uniform grain size as if processed through industrial filtration. Botanists collecting samples reported a faint metallic odor rising from the ground, and one graduate assistant noted tiny glass-like particulates embedded in the topsoil that glimmered under UV lamps, prompting initial theories of aerosolized silica from detonations, though no blast fracturing was found in the surrounding stone. When asked to provide geological access to deeper layers, the regional authority abruptly revoked the team's permit, citing maritime safety ray evaluation, an excuse that made no sense inland, which fueled rumors that the government had been pressured by external defense partners. Meanwhile, a set of forgotten hydrophone logs from a coastal monitoring buoy recorded broadband pulses during the night of the disappearance, bursts consistent with high-capacity generators ramping down, the sort used in temporary field labs operating off-grid. Yet no seismic spikes from heavy machinery transport were detected, implying equipment was moved via methods designed to mask weight signatures. Unofficial testimonies from Senja fishermen further complicated the picture. Several claimed they saw a dull orange glow behind the ridge moments before the fog rolled in, not bright like a fire but diffuse, like light bleeding through dust. And one described hearing a low resonant hum that felt like a power line in your skull, a phenomenon electromagnetic technicians later compared to interference from phased array prototypes tested briefly by NATO in the early 90s. Still, the most unsettling details surfaced in a sealed maritime incident report obtained by a journalist in 2008, describing how a patrol crew encountered a drifting crate near the area days later, its markings scraped off, containing only shredded insulation material and a lead-lined sleeve designed to hold something roughly the size of a portable reactor core. Though no radioactive trace remained, suggesting it had been cleaned with professional-grade decontaminants. The report ended with a note that higher command had collected the crate and ordered all crew statements classified until ongoing assessments regarding Senja installations are complete, yet no further documentation on such assessments has ever been released. Throughout 1996, quiet attempts by independent researchers to resurvey the ridge were met with logistical barriers that felt less like bureaucratic slowdowns and more like engineered obstacles, including sudden airspace restrictions allegedly tied to migratory bird studies, and temporary closures of shoreline trails due to erosion risks. Though satellite topography showed no significant landslide activity, still, one team managed to approach from the eastern slope during a period when the prohibitions briefly lapsed, noting that the ground emitted subtle warmth detectable even through insulated boots. A clue later cross-referenced with borehole thermography that revealed a persistent subsurface anomaly only a few meters deep, forming a heat oval approximately matching the perimeter of the former building. Chemical assays from smuggled soil cores found trace quantities of an exotic polymer used in the mid-90s for electromagnetic damping enclosures, normally deployed around classified sensor packages designed to capture ultra-low frequency signatures, including those associated with auroral disturbances and deep ocean resonance events. These findings pushed some investigators to suspect the Senja site had been part of a multinational effort to monitor something the public was never told existed, potentially tied to several suppressed NATO experiments involving cross-domain propagation, phenomena where geomagnetic, acoustic, and atmospheric data converged in ways that defied existing models. Meanwhile, a Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation freelance cameraman leaked fragments of a raw tape apparently shot days after the disappearance, showing uniformed personnel positioning mobile floodlights along the shoreline, and what looked like a sealed cylindrical object being hoisted onto a barge under heavy tarps. The footage shaky but authentic enough that defense officials quietly approached the network and acquired the original tape, leaving only degraded VHS copies that circulated among archivists, further complicating the mystery. Coastal radar logs from an NDY recorded intermittent blips over Senja's western ridge that night, not aircraft or drones, but irregular reflective patches with no transponder signals, drifting slowly, then vanishing, as if absorbing radar beams rather than reflecting them. Experts later described the signatures as sheer shadows, a term used in classified contexts, referring to transient interference patterns caused by high-energy fields bending atmospheric density gradients. Though no explanation was given for why such fields would manifest over an isolated ridge that ostensibly housed nothing more than a defunct weather shack, the convergence of heat residue, polymer traces, radar anomalies, and silent extractions painted a picture far more complex than a simple demolition, suggesting the lab hadn't been decommissioned. It had been evacuated in response to something that either malfunctioned or awakened underground. By 1998, the Senja incident had metastasized into scattered whispers within Scandinavian academic circles, most of them dismissed as fringe speculation, yet a handful of credible geophysicists privately shared their concerns with colleagues abroad, noting that the island's magnetic drift readings had spiked twice, once in late 1993 and again in early 1994, precisely bracketing the lab's disappearance. Both spikes showing waveforms eerily similar to auroral substorm signatures, but occurring at ground level, which was physically impossible under known natural mechanisms. Attempts to publish these anomalies in peer-reviewed journals were rejected without explanation, and at least one reviewer allegedly advised an author to avoid topics involving Senja for the sake of professional longevity. Concurrently, fragments of an internal maritime safety bulletin surfaced, describing unusual interference affecting naval compasses near the island, causing momentary swings of up to 27 degrees before stabilizing. The anomaly localized around the same coordinates where the heat oval persisted beneath the soil. Fishermen likewise reported that echo sounders behaved erratically within a 300-meter radius offshore, generating phantom returns that resembled submerged platforms rising and falling slowly, though sonar technicians later clarified that these patterns were symptomatic of dense refractive layers, similar to those produced by thermal plumes, escaping from man-made structures underwater. Despite mounting evidence that something continued operating beneath the ridge long after the surface installation was removed, official agencies maintained absolute silence, and when a retired defense contractor anonymously claimed the Senja Lab had been involved in studying cross-polar resonant modes, his statement was swiftly discredited as conspiracy, the term itself unlisted in any declassified research, until a redacted NATO briefing from 1991 resurfaced, showing diagrams of field lines looping beneath the Arctic crust like taut fibers, each labeled with cryptic identifiers suggesting these modes weren't theoretical but observed. The briefing hinted at periodic, oscillation flares, events capable of triggering harmonic surges that could interact with coastal geology, potentially destabilizing structures or instruments above them. If Senja's facility had indeed been monitoring these surges, then the precision, secrecy, and total erasure of the site implied that whatever they recorded in 1994 wasn't just a harmonic spike but a threshold event, one significant enough that the lab was evacuated, sealed, and literally scrubbed from the Earth before any trace could propagate beyond the chain of command. By the early 2000s, a quiet resurgence of interest in Senja began among European defense analysts after a trove of misfiled hydroacoustic cassettes was discovered in a Trondheim storage depot, each labeled only with month and year, capturing low-frequency events recorded along the North Atlantic cable routes. When digitized, several tapes from April 1994 revealed a peculiar rhythmic tremor emanating from the vicinity of Senja. Not earthquake signatures but patterned bursts with harmonic spacing closer to engineered systems, almost like a beacon broadcasting through the seabed, yet the pulses abruptly ceased at the exact timestamp, matching the lighthouse keeper's report of container transfers. One analyst described the signatures as structured silence, noting that between bursts the spectrum flattened unnaturally, as if damped by something absorbing ambient noise, a phenomenon virtually impossible in open marine environments. Cross-referencing weather station logs showed that during the same hours, barometric pressure dipped sharply in a tight corridor over the ridge despite stable conditions elsewhere, suggesting rapid localized heating or displacement of air mass, further implying the presence of machinery venting energy upward. Meanwhile, a former NATO communications officer leaked an internal procedural note, referencing a Senja override protocol, an emergency directive instructing monitoring stations to suppress anomalous magnetic readings near certain coordinates, leaving raw data untransmitted and replacing it with interpolated baselines. The document never explained the reason for the override, but its activation window aligned perfectly with the disappearance. Journalists attempting to investigate met resistance, including sudden revocation of access to coastal archives, and unusual scrutiny from customs officials, who searched equipment for sensitive electronics, confiscating notebooks containing sketches of the ridge's contours, an action normally reserved for restricted military zones. Though the area held no such designation, what began to trouble independent investigators most was the resurfacing of early 80s testimony from a retired engineer, who claimed he helped install subcrustal inductive loops beneath the island for a classified Scandinavian-American research program, loops designed to detect faint distortions in the Earth's magnetic substrate. But he insisted the loops were never calibrated correctly because the ground under Senja was already humming before we energized anything, a comment ignored at the time, but later revisited when researchers noticed that even modern magnetometers behave erratically on the ridge, drifting as though responding to an oscillation deeper and older than any human structure. By late 2004, several anomalies clustered to neatly disappearing buildings, erased foundations, structured tremors, suppressed data protocols, forming a narrative where the lab wasn't just Block 6. The pivotal breakthrough emerged in 2007 when a marine geologist from Bergen University analyzing sonar mosaics noticed an unnatural depression on the seabed west of Senja, roughly circular and about 30 meters across, with its edges partly collapsed as if something cylindrical had once protruded and was later extracted or descended further. Sediment age estimates placed the disturbance squarely in the early to mid-90s, matching the timeline of the island's erasure, and microfossil disruption patterns suggested intense localized vibration, akin to industrial drilling but without any metallic residues or tool signatures, implying a non-contact mechanism, possibly electromagnetic. Attempts to publish the finding were halted when the Norwegian Coastal Administration abruptly reclassified the area as a temporary exclusion zone, citing unexploded ordnance surveys, despite no historical records of munitions ever stored or deployed there. That same year, an anonymized packet reached a Helsinki research collective containing photocopies of heavily redacted documents, referencing a deep phase coupling incident at a northern test point, describing rapid fluctuations in geomagnetic shear values and subsequent, uncontrolled resonance bleed that risk compromising structural integrity of surface installations. The packet included a grainy still frame, apparently taken from a thermal camera, showing a glowing column rising from the ridge, tapering like a funnel, as if energy were venting skyward. independent analysts concluded the phenomenon resembled a standing wave inversion, where underground oscillations pierce the atmosphere in a narrow plume, an event difficult to imagine without catastrophic geological consequences. Yet eyewitness accounts from Senja mentioned only the strange fog and faint orange glow. Some speculated the lab's final act was to deploy a damping device, possibly the cylindrical object seen in old footage, designed to contain the resonance before it destabilized the ridge entirely. Others argued the extraction was the cause, not the solution, that removing the device let the underlying phenomenon recede into the crust, leaving only residual heat and magnetic drift. By 2010, the ridge remained eerily stable yet subtly wrong, its soil still unnaturally uniform, its air oddly quiet, as if something beneath the island continued to breathe at long intervals, too slow for human senses but perceptible to instruments that, even today, refuse to give consistent readings, as though the island itself remembers the lab that once monitored it and the threshold event that forced it into silence. By 2013, the Senja case drifted into a strange limbo between forgotten Cold War artifact and quietly monitored anomaly, but internal chatter within Nordic Geological Institute suggested the ridge had begun exhibiting renewed fluctuations, subtle yet unmistakable, intermittent low-frequency hums recorded not by instruments placed directly on the ground, those still malfunctioned, but by distant sensors kilometers away that captured faint echoes bouncing through bedrock like delayed aftershocks. These pulses aligned with seasonal auroral peaks, leading some researchers to suspect the island's subsurface structure acted as a resonant cavity tuned to geomagnetic storms, amplifying signals from deeper layers of the crust, or possibly from something artificial embedded long before the 80S installation was built. Attempts to re-enter the ridge were obstructed by a sudden, non-negotiable military presence. Patrol boats idled offshore without broadcasting their purpose, and hikers reported uniformed personnel politely but firmly redirecting them away from the old foundation site. Though no official restrictions were ever published, one mountaineer captured a brief thermal anomaly on his consumer-grade drone, a thin vertical line of heat, rising from a crack in the soil before abruptly vanishing, as if a shutter had closed beneath the surface. Cryptic leaks resurfaced the following year, when an Icelandic data analyst claimed to have intercepted metadata from a multinational monitoring network showing Senja flagged, under a category labeled continuity sites, locations maintained without public acknowledgement where instruments, presumably automated, continued to operate long after their host facilities were removed. The analyst insisted Senja's automated system remained active, transmitting packets through covert relays disguised as civilian telemetry, though the contents of those packets remained encrypted even to the upper tiers of scientific access. Meanwhile, a diver from Troms exploring the exclusion zone unofficially reported encountering a smooth, unnaturally cold pillar embedded in the seabed depression, where earlier sonar found the collapsed cavity, the object rising only a meter above the silt yet vibrating faintly when touched, as if resonating with internal energy. He surfaced shaken and refused to return, describing the contact as like touching a frozen heartbeat. The discovery reignited speculation that the lab's disappearance wasn't simply an evacuation, but a transition to a deeper phase of observation, leaving behind subsurface systems that continued to monitor whatever pulse had once threatened to breach the ridge. By 2015, independent experts who reviewed the mosaic of anomalies, thermal plumes, structured tremors, encrypted telemetry, cold resonant structures, concluded that the Senja installation had not been erased to hide human experiments, but to conceal an encounter with an energy form, whose behavior straddled. By 2016, the situation around Senja entered a phase that investigators later described as passive escalation, a paradox where nothing visible occurred on the island, yet every sensor network brushing its vicinity reported silent distortions, the kind that don't trigger alarms, but accumulate into patterns that feel deliberate. A Finnish atmospheric physicist who specialized in ionospheric scattering noticed that during several geomagnetic storms, the reflection height over Senja dipped by nearly 2 kilometers for intervals lasting no more than 30 seconds, a phenomenon resembling a sudden, localized thinning of the upper atmosphere as if an upward-directed field were briefly pushing charged particles aside. She submitted a report to IceCat, only to be quietly informed that the anomaly was instrumental drift, though internal logs clearly showed that diagnostic checks passed during the event, indicating the readings were genuine. That same year, an oil survey vessel north of Andes picked up an unexpected ultra-low frequency oscillation rising through the seabed, a sustained 0.8 Hz tone that technicians initially mistook for equipment overload. But cross-examination of the raw hydrophone stream revealed the tone modulating subtly, forming a quasi-pattern reminiscent of the structured tremors recorded back in 1994, as if the phenomenon beneath Senja were cycling through dormant phases and brief awakenings. Several crew members later admitted that during the oscillation they felt a faint pressure behind the eyes, as though their skulls resonated imperceptibly, a symptom documented decades earlier during classified field tests using pulsed and damping arrays. Meanwhile, the Norwegian Mapping Authority released a set of revised geomagnetic contour lines that quietly reoriented the local declination in a narrow band crossing the ridge, the shift too minor for public notice, but significant enough that specialists recognized it as evidence of a persistent, buried anomaly acting like a magnetostatic sink. Satellite altimetry further complicated matters by showing micro-fluctuations in surface elevation, millimeter-scale rises and falls occurring in smooth cycles, suggesting a slow-breathing mechanism in the crust, not tectonic but elastic. As if something beneath were expanding fractionally under varying magnetic load, attempts to access the ridge were met with subtle deterrents, not uniformed guards this time but a sudden surge of maintenance operations by agencies that never previously operated in the region, including a communications survey team that established a temporary repeater station directly over the old foundation site, then dismantled it within 48 hours without explanation. 2 hikers reported hearing a metallic ringing from beneath their feet near dusk, a sound that shifted pitch depending on where they stepped, like walking across an enormous buried tuning fork, one recorded. In 2018 the pattern sharpened. A coordinated surge of anomalies erupted across disparate monitoring systems, all pointing toward a synchronized reactivation beneath Senja, beginning with a sequence of hydroacoustic pulses, recorded across 4 separate North Atlantic arrays. Each pulse spaced exactly 19.7 minutes apart, the spacing so precise it suggested clock behavior rather than natural resonance, and the pulses bore spectral fingerprints nearly identical to the 1994 structured silence tapes. Broadband bursts surrounded by anomalously flat noise floors. Analysts noticed that during the 12-hour window of the pulses, a low but measurable uplift occurred along the ridge, raising the ground surface by roughly 3.4 millimeters before settling back at dawn, to smooth for seismic causes and more like a thermal expansion event. Simultaneously, a fringe radio astronomy group monitoring VLF bands detected a narrowband spike, centered on 17.34 kHz, drifting slowly as if Doppler shifted by movement underground, and when cross-correlated with magnetometer data from a Swedish research station, the spike aligned with a brief dip in local geomagnetic intensity, again localized precisely at Senja's coordinates. The most alarming clue surfaced from a weather satellite that inadvertently captured a faint vertical plume at 4:11 UTC, not smoke or steam but a thin column of ionized air glowing faintly in the IR spectrum, stretching nearly 400 meters above the ridge before dissipating, eerily reminiscent of the alleged thermal frame leaked in 2007, though this time the phenomenon was caught by a modern multispectral sensor. Norwegian authorities dismissed the plume as a calibration artifact, yet internal memos obtained later referred to it as an M-breach filament, a term not found in any public scientific glossary. Divers who approached the exclusion zone reported that the cold pillar, discovered years earlier, now emitted a slow, pulsing vibration that traveled through the water like a heartbeat, and one diver claimed the silt around the pillar had begun spiraling outward in slow, concentric waves, as if responding to an unseen force. Even more unsettling, a hiker camping near the ridge awoke to find his compass spinning lazily in a continuous loop, despite calm weather and no electronics nearby, and his wristwatch had reset itself to exactly 0 o'clock without losing battery. By the end of the year, independent researchers began piecing together the possibility that the Senja installation was never meant to study geomagnetic anomalies at all, but to anchor or stabilize a deeper system, whose origins predated the facility, maybe even human presence on the island. Whatever this system was, it appeared to be reactivating in cycles, guided by an internal logic no longer monitored by the vanished laboratory, leaving the island to pulse in the dark with a rhythm that felt less like a natural process, and more like the countdown phase of. By early 2019, what had once seemed like scattered phenomena coalesced into a coherent operational profile. The Senja anomaly was no longer intermittent but cycling with mechanical regularity, its pulses cascading through geological, atmospheric, and electromagnetic layers as though probing for structural weaknesses, or synchronizing with an external schedule. Geodesists monitoring satellite interferometry noticed that the island's surface exhibited a faint torsional oscillation, micro-twists measured in microradians, occurring at the exact midpoint between harmonic pulses detected offshore, implying a feedback mechanism deep in the crust. Something rotating or shifting with timed precision. In March, a Norwegian telecom technician investigating unexplained packet loss along a coastal fiber route discovered that data corruption only occurred when the cable signal path intersected a narrow angular window pointing directly at the ridge, as if the anomaly were projecting a transient low-frequency field that induced bit flip patterns matching known M interference signatures used in military jamming prototypes. Yet the field's amplitude was too weak to trigger alarms, functioning more like a probe than an attack. Later that month, a retired meteorologist hiking near the ridge claimed to witness a phenomenon he likened to air lensing, where the evening light bent in a smooth vertical arc over a single point on the ground, creating a shimmering distortion that resembled heat, haze yet measured cold to the touch when he stepped through it, his breath momentarily crystallizing despite mild temperatures. Shortly after, seismographs across northern Norway recorded a brief, subaudible thump, too soft to be felt but clear on instruments, followed by a spreading ripple that propagated outward in concentric rings, consistent with something retracting beneath the ridge, not expanding. Independent researchers analyzing magnetotelluric scans noted that the island's conductivity profile had shifted subtly, forming a hollowed-out region beneath the old lab site, like an evacuated chamber or a collapsed cavity, though no natural process could produce such a clean geometric footprint. Attempts to confirm it with ground-penetrating radar were thwarted, when equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, displaying blank returns or recursive echoes, behavior typically associated with strong M shielding or active signal scrambling. Meanwhile, a clandestine video surfaced on an encrypted forum, allegedly recorded by a pair of amateur explorers who approached the ridge at night. The footage, shaky and grainy, captured a low, rhythmic glow pulsing beneath the soil, illuminating thin cracks like veins filled with dim orange light that brightened and darkened in synchrony with distant hydroacoustic pulses detected earlier that week. The explorers fled after hearing a deep, resonant hum rising steadily, the camera cutting off as interference overwhelmed the audio.
Subscribe, and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from.